Joining us right now on the phone is the man who exposed the Bigfoot hoax, Steve Kulls, private investigator and executive director of Squatchdetective.com.
The numbers of sightings, even if you take 99% of them and put them in the trash can, you turn around, you still have that 1% that can't be explained. Well, we need to explain it.
And then this thing walks across the road, makes a turn towards us.
All I can remember is flipping the light on, and I see this creature.
Went to look forward, and there was a big black thing, is all I can call it.
The whole time, the whole thing was shadowing us, right behind us, right on the side of us.
I still see that damn thing to this day. It wasn't 20 feet from me.
You could see it standing from the moonlight in the tree line.
I was just scanning right to left, and it reminded me of like a gorilla.
Get somebody out here. Son of a bitch is about 6'9", I don't know.
Welcome to Squatch-D TV, exploring the Bigfoot mystery each week with your hosts, veteran researcher, author, and TV personality, the Squatch Detective, Steve Kulls, and from the Bigfoot Research Project of Kentucky, Chris Bennett. Sit back and buckle up as we bring you guests from around North America discussing the Bigfoot phenomena, but not without a few laughs too. Here are your hosts, Steve and Chris.
And good evening, cyberspace. Welcome to Squatch-D TV for today's date, April 30th, 2023. I'm your host, your guide, the Squatch Detective, Steve Kulls, along with my co-host who's up there.
I've made it to the top, man. I am top billing, finally.
He finally got that raise he wanted.
It was it was a long haul, but we finally made it, bud. Thank goodness.
I tell you what a pain in the derriere it was trying to get this together. For whatever reason, nothing was working, and then I'm going through one process of elimination through another. I had to reboot the computer, and then the computer started acting the best I can describe as dickish, and I had to reboot again because for whatever reason it didn't log me into it looked like everything was gone. So I rebooted saying, I don't know if I just lost everything that I had on my hard drive, and then everything showed up again.
You gotta love that, you know.
Okay. I checked the sound on the sound side of the computer. That seems to be working. I go over to StreamYard and no sound. Nobody can hear me. I can't hear anybody. And then I decided, I bet you it's friggin' Google Chrome. And I moved over to another browser and it works fine. So,
fair enough. That's it.
Sure enough. So,
man, I don't trust Chrome. Yeah, I don't trust Chrome anyway. I think that thing listens to you. Because me and Kevin was talking about it in the background a while ago, and I've been in the kitchen talking to my wife Sandy, and we'd say something about maybe a pizza or window blinds. Maybe we need to replace the window blinds downstairs, and then all of a sudden it pops up an ad, sale on window blinds. Click here, all stuff like that. It makes you wonder.
Yep. So I guess I'll be using this for the show from going forward. Anytime I need to broadcast.
I didn't know for sure we was going to have a show or not.
No, Chris was like, "You want me to call it? You want me to go?" Nope. Let's.
Steve was still in there fighting the good fight. Yeah.
Well, hello, Kevin. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Glad to be with you.
And we're so honored to have you on. And tonight we're going to be talking about Bigfoot DNA, the past, the present, and the future. And I got to say, your article really got me thinking, and it's really a deep article. So somehow, hopefully, I can, I can understand what you're saying because,
yeah, I wish that I made it a little more reader friendly.
Yeah. But you wrote it for science, so I understand that.
And it was really all in all, it was a very pleasant experience. It was good for me.
So anyway, what we're going to do is every week we do our roll call in the chat.
Oh yeah.
And it is hopping tonight, and we'll start off by saying the first one in, at least I thought it was, but apparently that may be a StreamYard thing. Let me just scroll up using the YouTube. Okay, so first in today was Ammon Chris, who said, Joan, get me another follicle sample. Mick, of course, I found in the house.
Good to see you, Mick.
B. Lynn, Uncle Bones, too, Low Rider.
Bones, Low Rider.
Bigfoot, Littlefoot. Welcome to the show. He says, I don't recall ever listening to this guy's podcast. Well, hello and welcome. Welcome to the world of sanity. Robert Twombly, hello, welcome. Pete H. Daniel Weeks. Pete. Pat Collins is in the house.
Hey, Pat. Good to see you, bud.
Patrick Cassidy's in the house.
Hey,
so a couple of Patricks in a row. Eyes in the Woods.
Nice.
Diane Trick is in the house. I know that means Charlie Wonton's running around somewhere.
Keep Jimmy in check.
Joe over to Bigfoot Atheist Inquiry. Hello, Joe. Raptor Crazy. Hello, Raptor.
That name change kills me, Joe. I love that.
I was going to say Kevin Harter's in chat too, but he's right here next to us.
Yep.
Oh, look, Kentucky Fried Fixes.
Good to see you, Kevin.
John Swan's in the house.
Hey,
Jim.
John.
Hello, Jim. Mike over at Tactical Bigfoot Research.
Tack. How you doing, Mike?
See, what did I say? Charlie Wonton in the house.
Yeah, there he is. Charlie.
Hello, Jeffrey. Little Kilroy recently here.
Little Kilroy.
Don Fuller made his way in late, but on time, actually, for today's show. Sasquatch Wizard Adirondacks. Hello. Hey, Curious Cryptid. Jen.
Welcome.
Tracy Bennett.
Hey, Jen.
Grasshopper. It is Texas Jack. So, boy, we got a full house in there tonight.
Good to see you guys, and glad to have you.
So where do we begin with this big DNA, not debacle, but DNA dossier? So I always say, Kevin, for those who don't know you out there, why don't you introduce yourself to the...
Sure. Yeah, my life in brief. I'm getting an echo in the headphones.
Maybe because of the volume on your, it may be because you're speaking on a computer speaker, so that may be.
Yeah, maybe.
Okay, is there a setting you can cancel?
It just went away. Yeah, thank you. So as I was about to say, my life in brief. I'm originally from Louisiana. Spent my early childhood there and in Mississippi. And then my sort of high school years, I spent here in Virginia, Shenandoah Valley, Harrisonburg, Virginia. The beautiful. And here, Harrisonburg has a really good high school, and one of the instructors there when I was in high school specialized in molecular biology, and he really developed a really good biology program, but especially with emphasis on molecular biology, and I excelled in that path of study. And so when I went off to college, my plan was to be a bio major, and actually I did the advanced placement test thing where you can get credit ahead of time. So that's actually what I did. I got advanced credit for the freshman biology classes. And then I didn't have the prerequisites to register for upper level bio. So I had to do, I did a year of chemistry and a year of calculus, and that was all. I did okay, but it was a struggle. And by the time I had satisfied prerequisites for upper level bio, I'd already kind of decided that I wanted to major in anthropology and philosophy. And actually, I was able to complete both of those majors. So because I'm kind of a big picture person, I like to see what the big context is. Helps me to understand what's going on, or at least I feel like I understand it better. So I did majors in anthropology and philosophy, and that was Duke class of '91, and that was the last year actually where the Department of Anthropology entailed both physical and cultural anthropology. After that, it split into biological anthropology, I believe, and I don't remember for sure, but I was the last year where anthropology was just treated as one organic whole, which is perspective that I appreciated.
Kevin, I gotta hop in there because we have something afoot. If DNA were contaminated, it would trace back to known DNA in the gene bank. No, it wouldn't.
Well, yeah, I think the contamination issue with the Ketchum study, it makes sense as an alternate explanation, but I think this whole thing that I was writing the essay about, mitochondrial introgression, provides a simpler and more thorough, better explanation for at least the mitochondrial data. I know there were big problems with the nuclear DNA data, and actually, let me pause here and say for Dr. Haskell Hart, I'm very grateful to you, sir, for your assistance in this process. I appreciate your comments. They were very helpful in working out that manuscript. And also Dr. Meldrum, I really appreciate it. And so actually, I had been working on this for a little while when Dr. Hart's book first appeared. And I saw the title, I saw the cover, and like a lot of people, I was a little confused by the cover, and I wasn't sure exactly what was intended with the two check marks on the, was it bear and the dog, and the X on the Sasquatch. I wasn't sure what exactly was intended there, but after I heard Dr. Hart's explanation, that made a lot of sense. He was just talking about that individual study and what was able to be found, and specifically with nuclear DNA. So the mitochondrial picture, it actually makes sense to still, even if the nuclear DNA were not reliable, even if that data wasn't reliable, the mitochondrial data could still be quite reliable. And even if it isn't, even if that particular study, even if you want to go there and say that it's not reliable, the larger pattern that seems to be emerging, and I know, I'm not sure how much, what extent Darby Orcutt agrees with this. Darby Orcutt, who's currently organizing a new DNA study, right? You mentioned that last week, didn't you?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. I chatted with him. Actually, we were going back and forth in Facebook comments. about what is it true that besides the Ketchum study, in addition to the Ketchum study, other private individuals have funded their own small-scale DNA testing of suspected Sasquatch samples, like hair samples, especially like hair samples. There's a lot of anecdotal reference to studies, but of course, in many cases, there has been when the study comes back for the mitochondrial DNA, identifies mitochondrial DNA with human, with known human haplogroups. Forgive me, I'm pausing for dramatic effect here. And I'm happy to be interrupted as I'm struggling to explain this also. So don't hesitate to stop me if I need to clarify something. But mitochondrial DNA, whether the Ketchum study is reliable or not, there seems to be a pattern emerging in other studies which have not been published and which we know about mostly anecdotally, that the mitochondrial DNA seems to be identified frequently as human, and if any of the nuclear DNA can be recovered, it proves to be unknown. If it's correctly interpreted, unknown, nothing to compare it with, not sure exactly what it is, but so that's the combination that Dr. Ketchum has been interpreting as.
Right. So Kevin, correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, I'm grasping at this. I'm trying to comprehend what you got going on here.
Please.
But if the mitochondrial DNA was found that a human, that would mean that it was passed down through the mother's side, correct, or through the mother?
Yes. And I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yep.
That's one issue that I try my best to clear up.
Can I time out? Of course, sure. Here's something I hear all the time. Ketchum's work at 12 other blind studying done the DNA came up with the same results. Okay, so the same primer was used, right? Because she patented the primer and sent it along with the samples. So if you have a bad primer, then it doesn't matter. And as I explained it to somebody earlier today, if I make a really nasty tasting cake and I send it to a lab to analyze, I send it to 5 different labs to analyze what's in that cake, they're all going to come up with the same ingredients. Guess what? It's still a nasty tasting cake. Right. So if you send a contaminated sample over there, they're just going to say, yes, this was the result we got. They're not interpreting the result. So don't misinform the public when you say they came up with the same results, but they didn't come up with the same interpretation of said results.
Right.
And that's
and I'm assuming that they.
It is what it is. As far as Kevin's audio be better. I don't control how people sound here. That's all on their end.
I'll try to speak up. So what I talked about in the essay. Well, let me back up because I listened to Dr. Ketchum's talk last week on World Bigfoot Radio. Mm-hmm. She had a lot of interesting things to say. And actually, if I'm not mistaken, there's a part 3.
So
of that.
This is the last question. And listen, if you're going to be disruptive, why don't you guys have Ketchum on next week's podcast? Because we've asked before and never got answered. So that's why.
So
I'm not going to keep asking.
What I try to clarify in the essay, and what Dr. Ketchum is still talking about, is the idea that Sasquatch is a hybrid, a human hybrid. And that was one of the big problems with reception of her paper in peer reviews. That really caused a lot of confusion, the whole human hybrid concept, because that really, if you think about it from the level of species, hybridity is a temporary thing. It's a temporary condition. It affects a small number of generations with diminishing effect over time. And the diminishing effect, of course, is all contained within the nuclear material. The mitochondria would stay the same because mitochondria is not diluted from one generation to the next. You inherit it all from your mother, right? But it is it doesn't go through the process of reassortment that nuclear DNA does. So you inherit 100% of the mitochondrial DNA of your mother. Right. Over time, if just for example, if say this combination of human mitochondrial DNA and something unknown nuclear wise, that combination has been suggested as evidence of Sasquatch. But then in the Ketchum study, they go further and say that this means that the Sasquatch is a hybrid. And that's problematic. There's, what I try to explain in the essay is that there's really no need to call it a hybrid. Actually, it's not. We don't really have enough information to identify it as a hybrid, just based on what's called mitonuclear discordance. So that's what Dr. Ketchum has been keying off of, this phenomenon of mitonuclear discordance, which means the mitochondrial DNA and the nuclear DNA don't seem to match. They seem to be from two different organisms.
Gotcha.
That pattern of mitonuclear discordance has, I believe, is also showing up in other studies. Well, I know for sure it's showed up in some other studies, and the question is only how many other studies and to what extent is this pattern continuing beyond the Ketchum study. If that turns out to be the case, if this pattern of mitonuclear discordance, human mitochondrial DNA, which is consistent with humans, nuclear DNA, which is unknown, that would be perfectly explainable given mechanisms that biologists have already documented and which are accepted, not completely understood, but widely accepted. And that's what I'm referring to with mitochondrial introgression. So back to the hybrid idea and the eternal. So here's the problem: a species is a whole population of individuals. So there isn't really, for a whole species, there is no such thing as a maternal and a paternal separate lineages, right? They're not separate in a species. They're only separate for individual.
Right.
So what's being called the maternal DNA, that's a bit of a misrepresentation, because that ignores the female contribution to the nuclear DNA, and it ignores the difference in how they're inherited, right? So each individual provides 50% of nuclear DNA, whereas the mother provides 100% of the mitochondrial DNA every time. So this, let's say this pattern of mitonuclear discordance seems to support the idea that it's a hybrid of some kind, but I'm going to suggest that it's actually would be more accurate to say that they are descended from hybrids, probably a relatively small number of hybrids. If we accept the haplogroups that the Ketchum study identifies, which Dr. Hart revises, Dr. Hart corrects and revises that data And actually, his revisions make that data, at least in my thinking, they make that data more plausible than the original, because a lot of the haplogroups are actually older than what Ketchum had identified them as. And because they're older, it's more plausible that they could have migrated from Asia across the Bering Land Bridge into America before that route of migration closed. There were that was one of the early questions about the study, is how could these haplogroups, which we believe to have originated in Europe and Asia, and especially like Southwest Asia, the Middle East, how could all these haplotypes have made it from the old world to the new world before the closing of the Bering Land Bridge? And so Dr. Hart's revisions make that issue a little more plausible, because many of the groups are older than they were first identified as. Let's suppose that there has been very rare interbreeding of these two species. That would explain where the mitochondrial DNA came from, or at least it provides one possible explanation of where the mitochondrial DNA came from. Let's suppose that the Sasquatch population was relatively small, which I think most people agree about. And I'm talking about relatively small in the old world in Asia. And so if this interbreeding happened on rare occasions, like thousands of years apart even, that would be sufficient to introduce the human mitochondrial DNA into the Sasquatch population. The nuclear material from, if it was only rare interbreeding like that, the nuclear DNA would be rapidly diluted in the coming generations, because there would be no hybrid mates available. Right. So assuming that the hybrid individuals had only would all pair with Sasquatch, the human mitochondrial DNA could be introduced into that population, and over time, especially if the population is small, because it is never diluted, because it remains 100% intact from generation to the next, whereas the nuclear material is always diluted. So within 10 generations, there's less than 0.1% of the nuclear material remaining. Unless there are additional human people in the mix, right? Unless there are additional hybrids. But the problem with that whole theory is that there would probably never be enough. There would probably never be sufficient hybrids to create a separate species, a separate group that is reproductively isolated from the rest. It's much more likely that these isolated interbreeding events were probably absorbed into the Sasquatch population. And if that is the case, then the data, this general picture of mitonuclear discordance, that general picture is perfectly explainable given current understanding of population genetics, and especially this phenomenon called mitochondrial interception.
Kevin, that's one of the things that I've had a real problem with, would be accepting that the Sasquatch species was a hybrid creation over the entire species. I can understand the individual, maybe there was a crossbreeding there at one point into the species, but as the nuclear genome, the regular full blood Sasquatch genome, would breed that small human element almost completely out of existence.
And so on Dr. Ketchum's most recent radio interview, she was talking about this and suggested that unlike before, she had maintained that it was human. Now she's shifting to a position where it's not human, meaning it's not Homo sapiens, but it's not ape either. It's between ape and human, or in other words, as I suggest in the essay, it's probably another hominin, right? It's probably a hominin, meaning a close relative of ours, but not a direct ancestor. Probably not a direct ancestor. Probably we have common ancestors not very far back.
We do have a number of questions popping up.
Please.
So I do want to get to Flat Rock's question, but this is an easy one. Raptor Crazy asks if you're a professor.
I am not currently a professor. I did play one in real life for about 23 years.
There you go.
First with the Department of Anthropology, and then with the Department of History.
Yep.
And I was happy to with anthropology. I was there for 3 years, and then the longer period, about 19 years, I taught courses for the Department of History, but actually my courses were all identified as humanities. And specifically, the course that I taught most often, year after year, and that which I really enjoyed, was great works of literature. And it was not limited to any particular genre or time period. So I started with ancient literature from ancient Greece, ancient Greek philosophy, specifically Plato and Plato's Republic. That actually when I started this teaching assignment, I kind of jumped in on short notice, and so they supplied me with a model syllabus, and I could use that, or I could make changes to it, or I could go some different direction. But what they supplied me with was really really great stuff. So what they supplied me with was intended to be starting with Plato and exploring all the using Plato's Republic, which is a well-known text, using that as the basis for the development of the rest of the course. So tried to work in as many different titles as I could up through 20th century and into fictional visions of the future. And I couldn't help but work in frequently. Sasquatch was becoming a minor theme in that course over the years. Actually, I was following the Ketchum study back in 2012. I was following the Ketchum study, and I was talking about it in class. And I remember the day that the news broke and everything, and I referred to it in class. I talked about mitochondrial DNA seems to be entirely human. What does that mean? And the whole hybrid idea, which I found to be confusing from the very beginning, because as I was saying, it's really a temporary, from the point of view of the species, it's a temporary condition. It's localized and temporary. It doesn't affect the whole species. Usually not, anyway. It's very, very unusual, very rare for that to happen in animals. It's different in plants. And actually, this is something really interesting that I learned in the process of researching and writing this. Plants, it's not uncommon for plants to create hybrid species naturally. When two different species are able to reproduce in the plant kingdom, sometimes it works out just fine. And even if they have different numbers of chromosomes, essentially what happens is they add them all up and divide by 2, and the hybrid species has a new number of chromosomes that neither of the parents have. That works in plants, but that is very, very rare in animals where hybridity is usually homoploid instead of changing the number of chromosomes. Homoploid means the number of chromosomes stays the same. That's the general rule with animals. Hybrid animals are generally homoploid, and that makes it much more difficult for a hybrid species to develop.
Question for you: does infertility also cause the hybridization, such as the mule and the horse creating the jackass? Jackasses are infertile.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
The infertility, that's a further bar to the development of a new species. And there's something that I explained in the paper called Haldane's law, which is actually from almost exactly 100 years ago, 1922. He came out with well-known, what they would call a law or rule now, Haldane's law or Haldane's rule, which explains that when interspecific hybrids, in other words, when parents of two different species are able to reproduce, it's very likely that the heterogametic species will be either missing or infertile. So what that boils down to is usually it's not uncommon at all, or it's actually the general rule for hybrid animal species to have only one sex fertile at most, unless they are very closely related, in which case they would probably be regarded as the same species to begin with.
Now I have a ton of questions that are spinning off of my mind, but I want to get to our viewers' questions, and then I want to get to my questions because Flat Rock asked if I touched hair with my bare hands and submitted it to and stuffed it in my pocket. Can't labs wash these contaminants away to get a clean DNA result?
I think that's correct, or at least that should be possible.
Was it possible 11 years ago?
I believe it was possible 11 years ago. I think that was. I think they had pretty well established protocols for how to deal with the possibilities of contamination, and they tried to also take into account the chain of custody. I know there are some questions about that. I know there's questions about. I know the provenance for the samples is not as exact and precise as we would wish. But the question is, you're moving beyond the Ketchum study. Is this an emerging pattern? Have there been how many other individuals have submitted samples for testing and gotten results that exhibit this pattern of bionuclear discordance, human mitochondrial DNA, and unidentifiable or nuclear DNA that just doesn't make sense? Does that make sense? What other questions are coming up?
Well, I kind of have the answer to this. Could it be possible that Bigfoot is a separate species not related to humans at all? Let me jump in and say that if a Sasquatch is a primate, it does have some relation to us in some sort of way. There's just no way around it.
Right.
Yeah.
And if it has been possible for interbreeding to happen in the past, then that means that we must be very, very closely related. If that's really true, we would have to be much more closely related to Sasquatch than chimpanzees, for example, or any of the other apes. Sasquatch would be our closest living relative if that turns out to be the case.
Yeah. Next question up is, and I believe we answered this. Let me interpret. Kevin Harter, does hybridization occur in any other mammals as it does in birds, crossbreeding?
My understanding is it's extremely rare in mammals. And in fact, among mammals, going back to what I was mentioning earlier about Haldane's law, among mammals, the heterogametic sex is the male sex. In other words, you know what I'm talking about here. The male has both X and Y sex chromosomes, and the female just has 2 copies of the X chromosome, right? It's the Y chromosome that makes you male, right? If you don't have a Y chromosome, you're not male. Right? You can inherit one or the other. And so actually it's the male's contribution that determines the sex of the child. They would have been really folks like some of Henry VIII's wives would have been really happy to know about that back in Renaissance when they were executed because they couldn't bear a son. Right now we know that those executions were not just because, in fact, the sex of the child is determined by the male's contribution. So, forgive me, where was I going with this? What was I responding to? About fertilization
in mammals.
Yes, in mammals. So, okay, the heterogametic sex is male, and so for Haldane's law, it typically affects the heterogametic sex. It means usually that sex is either absent among the offspring, there just aren't any offspring with that sex, or if they do occur, they're usually sterile. So the functional gene pool is limited to one sex or the other. For mammals, it's usually limited to females.
So it's almost like a safeguard against crossed.
Right.
You know,
it functions as a barrier to, it basically is one of the standard kind of barriers to crossbreeding or hybridizing. Actually, so the term hybridizing is correct if it's two separate species. If you're talking about hybridizing within a species, like say different breeds of a dog, the technical term there is interbreeding. But if you're talking about separate species, it's hybridizing is the correct term. And that's more significant. So a lot of these processes act as barriers to producing a new species. It's unusual, and this is non-standard, and it's actually the technical term for it is horizontal gene flow, right? Gene flow that crosses the usual barrier between species. That's what they mean by horizontal. It's unusual. It's not the rule. It's the exception. The result of hybridizing. Horizontal gene flow, and specifically mitochondrial gene flow. That's what they call it. It begins with the first hybrid births, and if there are females among the hybrid birth, then if they continue to have female offspring, gene flow is continuing for as long as that matriline or for as long as that lineage continues of female offspring. That's horizontal gene flow. If that process continues for long enough, it can result in the complete replacement of mitochondrial DNA, not the nuclear, just the mitochondrial DNA. That's what's known as mitochondrial integration. So it takes a period usually of thousands of years, but of course it depends on how rapidly the species reproduces. This phenomenon of mitochondrial integration happens all across multicellular life. It happens in plants, it happens in fish, it happens in birds, it happens in frogs, it happens in bears, it happens in monkeys, and in fact, and this is what I find most persuasive, this mitochondrial integration phenomenon is accepted now as having occurred between sapiens and Neanderthals. The Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA turned out to be not. Let me back up here. Some of the earlier Neanderthal sequences that they've recovered from a cave in Spain called Cima de los Huesos, Pit of the Bones. They've recovered mitochondrial DNA from there. They estimate to be about 450,000 years old. And so the theory is those are representative of an earlier phase of Neanderthal. Later Neanderthal specimens have been, fossil specimens, right, have been recovered from other places further east in Asia, a couple different places. And when they got around to extracting mitochondrial DNA and analyzing it and using special techniques to recover ancient DNA, they had the advantage of having fossil specimens that they were sure were Neanderthal. But the mitochondrial DNA, and I explained all of this and provided all the citations in the essay, but mitochondrial DNA of Neanderthals was completely replaced by mitochondria, which apparently derived from Homo sapiens, probably from as they were departing Africa. One of the many waves of migration out of Africa, there was interbreeding between sapiens and Neanderthals, and the earlier mitochondrial genome was completely replaced by sapiens lineages. And when they learned of this, when they found, when they got these unexpected results, they didn't, and they meaning the authors of the people who conducted this analysis and the authors of these studies, they didn't talk about a hybrid species. They didn't even suggest that a new species had happened. Rather, they immediately, the prevailing theory immediately was gene flow, phenomenon of gene flow, changing what they expected to find. And now that's the accepted explanation, because as I explained in the essay, actually Neanderthals and Denisovans are more closely related. Their nuclear DNA is more similar than either of them is to humans. However, Neanderthals, as I said, have mitochondrial DNA that's entirely derived from human sources, Homo sapiens. And so with that example from, a species that is probably, of the fossil species, the species that are now extinct, Neanderthals probably are our closest relative. Probably even more closely than Sasquatch.
So Mike has a question. What kind of markers are they finding?
Well, that's the issue. It's what to look for, what to identify as distinctive in the nuclear DNA that can serve as a marker. That's the big question right now. Because as we've said, there's nothing to compare it to. Obviously, a specimen that is clear and unambiguous would solve a lot of these problems right away. But in the absence of a specimen, I think you could still make a good argument that there is an unrecognized species out there and that it is closely related to us. And the general picture of this mitonuclear discordance is really easily explained through this phenomenon of mitochondrial introgression. In fact, one of the studies that I cite in the essay suggests that it's the most likely result. This transference of mitochondrial DNA is the most likely result when closely related species hybridize. Specifically, the pattern is the gene flow goes from the settled, the established population. So in this example, the established population would be Homo sapiens. If the Sasquatch plays the role of an invasive species, there's a pattern that's well established of mitochondrial introgression from the settled species into the invasive one. If that makes any sense. So it's kind of counterintuitive. And what the invader, if it's just rare instances of hybridity, the invasive species doesn't have any effect on the other species. Instead, they take away it's very common. In fact, it's probably the most common result to take on the mitochondrial DNA of the other species. So the invasive species is the one that is affected by the mitochondrial gene flow. That's the typical pattern.
That would also lead back to her samples. What evidently all her, if every one of her samples goes back to this human mitochondrial DNA, then that means she must have had a very small group there that all these samples came from. But from what I understand, now I'm not certain, but I think these samples were sent in from all over the country or all over the world.
All over the country, yeah. The U.S. and Canada,
right?
And so in the essay I go through, I try to make use of Dr. Hart's revisions. It might have been better if I had written this up without making the Ketchum study the central example. But Dr. Hart's book actually encouraged me. When at first I was discouraged. Actually, so going back, I started to tell you a story earlier about the cover of that book. I was confused by the cover of his book, and actually that was in 2020 that came out, and I had been working on these ideas for a little while. And when I saw the cover, I ordered a copy of it. I wasn't going to do the Kindle thing. I prefer to have an actual book to hold in my hand when it's possible. So I ordered a copy of it, and I also wrote to Dr. Meldrum. That was the first time I made contact with Dr. Meldrum, because he wrote the foreword to Dr. Hart's book. And so I basically wrote to him asking, I've been working on this essay for Relic Hominoid Inquiry, and I just wonder if you think it's worthwhile to continue, or if Dr. Hart's new book has basically discredited everything about that study. And Dr. Meldrum was very encouraging. So I continued, and that was the beginning of about 18 months of very sporadic and sparse correspondence between me and Dr. Meldrum, leading up to the publication of that essay. What else?
I say my issue with the study has always been that it seems like all the samples she got were Bigfoot DNA. She excluded, if any, very few. And when reading Dr. Hart's book, there was very clear that there was some bear DNA in a couple of the samples. There was some sheep DNA in a couple of the samples. Maybe another ungulate or two that was in the samples, which would be very indicative of contamination.
Right. And also, or misidentification. Right. Yeah.
And my other concern is that knowing what was going on at the time of and actually knowing people that were working in the project at the time, that they were getting ready to declare the SMEHA sample as this is Bigfoot, and now we have somebody that saw it. And as it turned out, SMEHA turned around and analyzed it by a different lab who came back and said, no, this is a bear.
Right.
And he kind of threw that in Melba's face a bit, saying, you were getting ready to say this is a Bigfoot. This is why this is not a legit program. And that's my only fear, is that she has received so much criticism in the past that now she's moving her goalpost to sound more mainstream,
right?
To get more acceptance because she's getting a new study going.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because something I should have mentioned already. I think this is actually the main problem with the original study, is interpretation of the data. And we can just refer only to the mitochondrial data in this case, because the nuclear DNA, I think, was pretty well explained by Dr. Hart as erroneous. But even so, that leaves 27 mitochondrial DNA samples, and and those were mostly from hair samples, and it should be the relatively straightforward, the relatively simple aspect of this project. But nuclear DNA is much more difficult to recover. And then, so in the recent interview with Ketchum last week, one thing that she mentioned that surprised me and that I had not heard before was that they what she suspects to be Sasquatch samples do have a medulla, but that medulla does not yield DNA, does not yield mitochondrial DNA. There's so with the hair samples, there's really no expectation that they can recover nuclear DNA, but usually the medulla of a hair sample will yield mitochondrial DNA. And Dr. Ketchum was very specific about that, saying they were unable to recover any DNA from the medulla, even though it was present in what they suspected to be Sasquatch samples. So that was odd. I thought the main issue there with the ability to recover DNA from hair samples was whether or not the medulla is present, because generally speaking, that analysts have been successful in retrieving DNA from the medulla of mammal hair.
And traditionally, Sasquatch hairs have lacked a medulla.
That's my best understanding, but she was very specific about that, at least according to her, that's mistaken.
And that's where there's this divergence, which she says, like the hybridization occurring 15,000 years ago, like, oh, we found that Sasquatch hair has a medulla. They go against convention. They go against the norm of what we have known in the past. And why is it different or special just to her case when the Chinese government analyzed a urine hair many, many years ago, and they found that it lacked a medulla? I have actually seen that hair because Paul Bartholomew up in upstate New York, a researcher, actually had inherited it from Dr. Warren Cook, who visited the Chinese scientist that did this analysis.
Wow. So I got off track there. I was leading up to what I think is the big error in interpretation that I think was at issue. One of the issues with the original Ketchum study. Interpretation of shucks. I got my thought there. There was, what I'm trying to explain in the essay is that there really isn't any justification for saying that a new species began, even if these hybridization events happen. That is not adequate reason to say that it's a new species. And so what I'm trying to explain in the essay is that this could have resulted in essentially what the Sasquatch could be a completely separate species, and it was existing before these hybridization events. And as a result of these rare hybridization events, it's very possible that the Sasquatch mitochondria have been replaced by human mitochondria, but that would be the only human thing about it, right? That would be the only human thing about that species, if in fact it is a separate species.
I mean, is it possible that the Homo sapien DNA or the mitochondrial DNA that was Homo sapien was very more dominant than perhaps the host species? Is that kind of bringing it down into?
That would be the case for the mitochondrial DNA, absolutely.
Yep.
But of course, the nuclear DNA would be diluted each generation, rapidly diluted away to negligible levels, unless there was a consistent supply of hybrids, and that's very unlikely because that hybridization is unusual to begin with. It's against the usual separation between two species. So it's perfectly possible if Sasquatch is a real thing, and if it is a hominin, if it is, in other words, another if it's essentially of the same genus but a different species, it could be perfectly reasonable to find that it carries mitochondrial DNA derived entirely from humans. But that would be the only thing about it that is human, or that would be the only thing that it would be consistent with what other biologists have found if the only thing about it was the mitochondria. Because it's really not that big of a deal. Mitochondria are, so, biologists have used mitochondrial DNA to identify species because it's readily available, right? It's so much easier to recover than nuclear DNA. So mitochondrial DNA has been the molecule of choice for identifying and discriminating between separate species. But they do that way just because it works. The mere fact that mitochondrial DNA would change, the mere fact that the mitogenome could be completely replaced, that would not really affect the species as a whole. That would just, it's perfectly possible that the only thing affected is mitochondrial DNA and the rest of the species is intact. It would have been present before. So that's the main problem with the interpretation of Ketchum. There's no reason to say that it's a brand new thing. There's no reason to say that it's the beginning of a species, and there's no reason to say that the paternal source is unknown, because there is no paternal source. The paternal and the maternal source are the same, with the exception of these rare instances of hybridization.
Right.
So I think that's one big problem of interpretation, because so the assumption then would be that if the paternal, so to speak, the way that I've heard it explained, if the paternal lineage and the maternal lineage are not the same, then where did this come from? But I'm suggesting that's actually overcomplicating things. It makes much more sense just to speak of one other species that is not the same as us, but very closely related. If that's the case, it's perfectly possible for the mitochondrial DNA to be modified in the way that appears to be the emerging pattern through this process of mitochondrial integration. So that, what other questions are coming up? I'm sorry, I'm a little scattershot here.
Yeah, we're gonna go down the rabbit hole. Bigfoot Littlefoot asked, could humans have been hybridized from the Bigfoot? And I don't think so, but it is a rabbit hole type of question. But
right, and that it seems much less likely. So the theory is that the most likely kind of crossbreeding would be males of the Sasquatch species abducting human females, right, and taking her back to their back into their territory, and her offspring, if her offspring survive, and if they are fertile, because it's not unlikely that they would be fertile, but it would be unlikely that they would have fertile mates of the opposite sex that are also hybrids.
Right.
So it's perfectly possible that the foreign DNA could be introduced into the Sasquatch population, and over time, it could spread and take over the whole genome, simply because the older lineages die out over time. So the pre-existing mitogenome is, if you think of it as being simplified over time, that's the general effect. A diversity, if it's a small population and they're just breeding among themselves, this inbreeding problem, this inbreeding thing can become a problem, leading to the lack of any diversity within the mitogenome. So when that happens, one remedy is injection of a completely new lineage of mitochondrial DNA. It's well, and there's a lot that that they're still trying to understand about how this process works. But essentially, it's a question of the older lineages, which are pre-existing, dying out over time and being gradually replaced by these newer ones that have been introduced. But those aren't going to be a permanent part of that species either. That it will continue to change over time. And actually, so, in Dr. Harter's book, he explains that the haplogroups, the mitochondrial DNA showed about half of the samples seem to be significantly somewhat different from normal human DNA, right? Normal human mitochondrial DNA. About half of the samples seem to be somewhat unusual, and in other words, too many mutations, or unusual mutations that usually don't occur in human mitochondrial DNA. When it's transferred to the new species, we can assume that the pattern of new mutations would also change because it's part of a new species. The usual pattern, the most likely pattern of mutation, would change. And so, in other words, the total picture of the mitochondrial data is plausible. There's really nothing implausible about it. And even if you want to discard the custom study completely, this mitochondrial integration thing does seem to explain this emerging pattern of mitonuclear discordance. Or in other words, it explains how Sasquatch could have human mitochondrial DNA, but it's still Sasquatch. It was Sasquatch before that, and still Sasquatch after that has replaced the older mitochondrial DNA. That makes some. So Dr. Ketchum is when she says that it is something brand new, and it's not an ancient. It's a brand new species from about 15,000 years ago. That's what I'm suggesting is incorrect. That it would make much more sense with mainstream evolutionary theory if it's just one other species, and the hybrid thing is really a misinterpretation.
Yeah.
Yeah. So my interest in this is really comes down to, I think that Melba probably would have benefited from having another scientist working with her.
Absolutely. And actually, I'm glad you bring that up, because all of the other scientists listed as part of the project were all microbiology or molecular biology folks. If I'm not mistaken, there weren't any PhDs with a broader picture of what I think was missing among the experts that contributed to the project. I think they needed somebody with a broader understanding of how the data are situated in the animal kingdom and in evolutionary theory in general. That's really the main. I think that's the main mistake, is suggesting that something completely new developed, and because there is no. So what they suggest is that there's no that humans and whatever the other species is do not share any common ancestry, and that's contrary to evolutionary theory, right? The evolutionary theory says that we're all related, and even if we don't know what this other species is, we have to assume that somewhere back in the tree of life we have common ancestors. What Dr. Ketchum seems to be saying is that this paternal source is completely new and unknown, and and we do not share ancestry with it. And actually, she's very frank about her view now that she, there's basically two explanations that make sense to her. One would be the Nephilim idea from Genesis chapter 6, the whole hybridization of the fallen angels. And so that would mean that DNA would be, or if DNA is what they have, it would be
angel DNA.
Right, it would be something that we don't share any biological ancestry with. Right, that's what the assumption is.
Right.
That
I think that may be one of her problems with interpretation, or she's really reaching for something that's clearly not explained in the data.
There's really no need to talk about such a well, it really doesn't make sense to talk about such a recent beginning to the species. If this mitochondrial integration thing is correct, then it would be much older than its mitochondrial DNA. But the species would have been around for a long time.
Raptor just made a comment that got my mind spinning. And he said, how does Bigfoot have feet like ours? There had to be some interbreeding way before Neanderthals. Now, see, this is my whole problem with the Ketchum study, was that they, and this doesn't go to any scientific part, this issue, is there was a lot of greed, I think, in that study. I think she wanted to be the top dog. She wanted to have her name in the limelights. I think she wanted, the full monetization of it. She wanted, me. Because of that, I am sure there are some samples in there that probably were legitimate. Right. And I think that's where we're, it's like, okay, here's this study. Everybody's sending their samples. Boom, 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 boom.
Right.
So we can't, on the surface, we all poo-poo the study, but there's got to be some good stuff in there somewhere, which this makes what you're saying makes perfect sense. And with Raptor's statement there, just clicked something in my mind, is the divergence of like the ape foot from the Sasquatch foot. It doesn't have that the opposable big toe almost. Used for grasping. They do look like ours. They're not quite like ours. They're almost like a combination of an ape foot and a Homo sapien foot.
That commonality is not necessarily a evidence of hybridizing. It's more likely evidence of common ancestry.
Right.
And that's a big mistake that seems to be common in this discussion, is hybridizing is a temporary thing, and it usually doesn't produce a new species. It's very unlikely to do that in animals. And so there's no rationale for saying that the paternal lineage is something completely new, and that we're not somehow that we don't share any ancestry. The more mainstream evolutionary theory would suggest that we all share common ancestry, and it's just a question of how far back is that.
Now here's this wild rumination that Melba helped identify 9/11 victims. No, that is a tale spun by some of the people. That's internet spin. And if she said it, no, they're not going to a veterinarian to analyze DNA. She is not a geneticist.
Right. I have no idea how
that did not happen.
I did hear her explain that in her interviews last week. And so actually what I'm trying to do with the essay is, the mitochondrial data, it makes sense to refer to that as an example. But what I'm trying to explain in the essay is that even if you throw out the Ketchum data, if in the future this pattern is established of twin mitochondria but nuclear DNA, which is something unknown, that would be perfectly reasonable, and that actually fits within mainstream evolutionary theory.
Right. Let me say something to Bigfoot Littlefoot. If you knew some of the back stories of that whole study, you would understand where I'm coming from. I'm not saying the entire study was garbage, never have. I always said garbage in, garbage out, because I don't think her primer was right, but Kevin's kind of opening my mind to a couple other things. And if this is the case, what Kevin is saying, then within that study, there are some samples that are good. The problem is that Melba had so much confirmation bias in her,
right,
that she came to the conclusion before the samples were even analyzed.
Right.
If you recall her opening the study, oh, these are a people, and this is a new species. No, right. Obviously it's not. And obviously, like I think you even said, there's 27 samples that seem to be non-contaminated.
Right. Right. At least, well, really, they started out with over 100, but apparently the first step in identifying DNA, that consumed the entire sample for about 70 some odd samples, where it didn't cross beyond the first phase of identification. There wasn't any sample left. And also so there's the additional complication that with hair samples, as she explains, they didn't recover any DNA from the medulla. They recovered all the DNA that they recovered from hair samples came from skin tags on the exterior, near the follicle or on the follicle. So apparently that is a critically important thing for if there's any hope of recovering DNA from hair samples. It's extremely helpful for the follicle to be intact.
Yep.
That might be critical. It's hard to say. All of this should become slowly more clear over time if people continue seeking out samples and analyzing them. What else are people asking about?
Right. So I guess what I'm trying to get my point across is that there may be 3 or 4 samples in there that are legit, that are not contaminated, that are exactly as you say they are, that they show signs that there might have been a hybridization many, many years back, and that the mtDNA has kind of kind of amplified a bit over the years.
Right. It's a process that takes place over the generations.
Right. But the analysis that she makes is completely, to me, biased, but is completely wrong in fact, and that's probably the reason why a lot of the peer review shot it down.
Yes, that was definitely one of the big issues. Right. For the peer reviewers. It wasn't, I mean, actually the raw data wasn't even supplied to the initial submission. So what the reviewers were going on was how it was explained. And their main problems were, this explanation doesn't make sense. So what's the next most likely explanation? Well, that's contamination.
Right. And what we go back to is the problem she had with the Texas Court Commission, where she got found, negligent in professional misconduct and professional negligence. And that was because now mind you, this is why I have a problem with her 9/11 story, because she has no background in testing human DNA. It's always been animal DNA, particularly cats, up until this particular case that occurred, I think, in 2012. So she had no background in 2001 of testing DNA at all, except on cats. So why would they go to her with some of the most sensitive stuff that happened. I think this is, again, more grandiose statements from a person who is me.
Right. And also that the general reluctance of mainstream biologists to take on a project like this. People serious about their careers are afraid of any stigma, and the stigma is really a career killer, I'm sure. So in other words, qualified people are
reluctant.
Reluctant, yeah. And she probably got into the project initially out of some naivete. But then, the interpretation that she's offering makes a lot of sense if you are, if your worldview is biblical, if your worldview is strongly shaped by the Christian tradition, then that connection with the whole hybrid offspring, gigantic hybrid offspring, that is a very attractive idea if you're into that part of the Bible.
Right.
Gotcha.
But there's really no justification for saying it's something new. There's really no justification for saying that it's
novel.
Right. There's right. There's no justification for saying that it's not ancient, or that it is it's not a hybrid. It starts out at many generations back. There was one. For example, there was one hybridization event, and then the descendants of that are gradually lose. Over in just a few generations, they lose any effective hybridity. They go back to being like normal Sasquatch, but they would still carry the human mitochondrial DNA, and that would not change. That would remain 100% intact because it's not diluted from one generation to the next.
Right. And you know what I love that, and I just thought, I'm like, wow, this is a really cool conversation, because we're taking the data that Ketchum got and we're looking at it in a whole nother prism, which I find kind of refreshing, actually.
Yeah, mainstream evolutionary theory, actually.
Right.
It's much simpler, much simpler to apply mainstream evolutionary theory than the whole hybrid idea. The hybrid idea never made sense to anybody.
In stereo. That's funny.
Well, I could see a small population. Yeah, that could these things happen probably in every species. There's going to be a small population where something has mixed around, but that's not a permanent thing. That's just going to keep on.
Right. If it is a separate species to begin with, then hybridizing is not likely to change that.
Right.
Mick, go ahead. Post one of your questions right there in chat. I lost it somewhere.
And really, if the so the change, a theorized change in DNA, in the mitochondrial DNA, just is not an adequate reason to suggest that this is a completely new species that doesn't share any ancestry with other hominins.
And Pete H., if you asked a question, like I say, just put your questions in caps. Sometimes when people are talking, this chat scrolls really fast. So I only have this much screen to look at, and if everybody's talking, so please put them in caps for your questions, so it kind of makes them stand out.
Yeah, and I find this DNA discussion very fascinating. I know just a little bit about DNA. I know what the base pairs are and stuff, but as far as the method of sequencing DNA and stuff like that, whoa, that's up here. That's beyond me.
For the essay, I'm not referring to any hardcore chemistry at all. I'm just talking about patterns of inheritance,
right?
Which is really a much simpler thing than the chemistry. I'm relying on Dr. Hart's explanation of the Keston data. And actually, I didn't feel like I understood the Keston study adequately until I read Dr. Harter. And then that his revisions really encouraged me to go ahead and try to explain what this whole hypothesis.
I liked it. I think you've got a perfectly plausible essay here. I mean,
it really sounds unlikely. You know, it sounds like a far-fetched thing until you start researching what biologists have already documented.
Right.
The other thing about it, about mitochondrial introgression, is that it is not easy to detect unless you do a lot of sampling. So it's been documented many times, but those were always the result of intensive sampling, where you get lots of individuals. I try to explain that in the really that's something I'm quoting other experts about in the essay. Is this no, I'm sorry.
So Kevin, what's your thoughts on her now working on mermaid DNA and
that? I'm kind of shocked at the way this new project is being explained. And again,
dog man DNA.
Yeah, what she said about that, she said basically obviously that does not fit well with mainstream evolutionary theory, right? Whereas Sasquatch is much more plausible, right? As if indeed it is another hominid, right, closely related to us, that's plausible, and it's even plausible that there could be this not exchange, but there could be this gene flow from humans to Sasquatch, resulting in this introgressive replacement. That's all plausible. I'm sorry, go ahead.
One other question. Raptor said he lost connection for a minute about the Bigfoot feet question.
Oh yes. So I what I was trying to say there is that the similarity in the foot morphology, similarity between humans and Sasquatch, is much more likely to be the result of common ancestry rather than hybridizing. It's really not evidence, at least not in mainstream understanding of evolutionary theory. That's not evidence of hybridizing. That's evidence of common ancestry. And in fact, I mean, this reminds me of, well, now that I start to mention it, but now I hesitate to mention it because it's bringing up bad memories of the porcupine man. Because I debated with him over these issues in Facebook comments, Facebook commentary. I debated with him back in 2020, before actually it might have been more like 2019, I guess. It was before the porcupine fiasco, and we argued bitterly about this, and I felt insulted at one point, and so I kind of went off, and then before I knew it, I had been blocked.
Of course,
he blocked me on Facebook and on YouTube, and so and I guess I had that coming. I don't know, but in my mind I was telling him I was trying to get across some points that were never addressed adequately, and something that I knew was wrong. So my attitude was, I'm going to get this point across, even if it causes tension, and we'll get over it gradually. But then, unfortunately, communication ceased, and that's actually so. After we argued about that, and he blocked me, that's when I started working on the essay.
And Curious Cryptid said being blocked by Noel is a badge of rationality.
Well, actually, so while I was working on the essay, I started to take shape, and I had the basic idea figured out, and really this is not my idea. All I had to do was look up what biologists had already learned. After I did that, I posted on Facebook a very short excerpt, like a one-page excerpt with some conclusions on it. And apparently, in response to that, the Porcupine Man, this was before he was Porcupine Man. Apparently, in response to that, he created a whole new video defending Melba Ketchum, and it's on Impossible Visits on the Impossible Visits channel now. It's the one that's entitled "Why Melba Was Right." So I guess the title is "Sasquatch is a human, another human species. Why Melba Ketchum was right about the DNA." Apparently, he produced that just because I put out that excerpt. But what that video contains is heinous misinformation. I mean, it's really badly wrong. He refers to the hybrid, he says it's a hybrid species, and that's exactly what doesn't make sense. The whole concept of a hybrid species in the animal kingdom just is very unlikely. And in that video, he includes examples of, the lion with lion's mane and tiger spots, right? And refers to that as a species, and that's not a species, right? That's a really unfortunate use of genetic diversity. And whatever people are in charge of those animals, they're really disappointing all of us by allowing these two different species to breed and produce what is going to be useless in preserving their lineage. What's useless in preserving the species, right? That those hybrids, tiger-lion hybrids, are useless in preserving either species, right? So anyway, check out that video on Impossible Visits, the one about Sasquatch is another human species, which I think he produced that with me in mind. And there's actually one slide in there which says something about what do cynical people really want?
Well, Kevin, I have a video right here with you in mind.
Oh my goodness.
Here it is.
All right.
Yes, this video is brought to you by that guy from Vermont, who liked to think a few years back that Rick Dyer actually shot a Bigfoot. Also happens to be pals with Mr. I'm Gonna Shoot Bigfoot from Behind, Mr. Scott Carpenter, and a very staunch Melba Ketchum believer and woo baiter, Mr. Chris Noel. And in this video, he says a Sasquatch is climbing up a tree. Well, obviously, as we look at it, does it kind of look like he's close to the tree? Maybe. But what it is, it's really a porcupine. And I don't know how we can miss this or misident this. This is the kind of guy that walks in the woods and thinks everything is a Sasquatch. He should go out squatching with Todd Standing. They can make tremendous work. And by the way, this guy is so arrogant, he likes to think he's one of the premier investigators in the Northeast. Well, if this is his critical thinking and strong rationalizations, well, I guess his college degrees really didn't work too well, did they? Well, anyway, this is the same cat who also asked me to lie about an evaluation I did, or by putting out some information that had already been out there on the web, and he blames me. So what does he do? He asked me to lie. Yep. What a character. Anyway, that's this week's bogus Bigfoot Roundup.
Wow, that's awesome. When the porcupine thing came out, I was losing my mind because he blocked me, and I couldn't explain to him what was wrong with that analysis. And Chris, if you ever get to see this, the whole problem is, when you do that measurement thing that you got from Thinky Funker, the whole thing where you measure the thing on the video and then you go and measure it on the real tree.
Right.
For that to work, you have to use the same spot. You have to use the same spot on the tree. But instead, he uses the base of the tree for the actual physical measurement in real life. And on the video, he's talking about a place that's like 7 feet up in the tree. Right. So you got to use the same spot for that to work. Right. I don't know. I went crazy on that whole thing, like a lot of people, but unfortunately, I couldn't even comment.
Well, that's one of the things Right. That's one of the main things we try to do on the show, Kevin, is promote the truth. And we try to make sense of sometimes senseless situations.
I'm sure Chris believes he's still on the side of truth, but it's a perspective problem.
Yes, exactly,
and a personality problem too.
Yeah. I mean, I got personality problems too, and Chris, if you want to unblock me, we can talk about our personality problems. I'll still be your friend if you want to unblock me. We can talk about our personality problems.
Well, folks, we're winding up the show because we're just 9 minutes to 11, and 2-minute outros. We got about 7 minutes. So I want to thank Kevin for coming on. This has been a really enlightening conversation, probably one that I have to replay and re-listen to because it's been mind-blowing.
Well, yeah. I hope it makes sense when you listen to it again. I really appreciate you having me on. I'm honored. Thank you both. Thank you very much. And thanks to everybody in the chat. I haven't been able to watch that very carefully, but shout out to Joe Snyder, Nicky Colon, Brent Dill, some folks that I've got to know in Facebook. I'm leaving out people. Oh, and Curious Cryptid. All those folks. I feel like I've known you for months.
Great bunch of guys. Great bunch of guys.
Well, Bigfoot, Littlefoot, I'm more than willing to have her on.
Sure. Welcome. Welcome.
We'll give her a fair shake.
And I would enjoy having Melba Ketchum on the show.
There'd be some tough questions. Got to admit, there's going to be some tough questions, but I'm willing to suspend my disbelief. And
sure.
Here's a funny thing. Her interview with Bigfoot Radio, it was 2 parts, and there was part 3 scheduled for tonight at the same time. Like tonight at 9, supposedly it was part 3 of that discussion. I don't think it was the same day as the first interview. I think it was something added later. But anyway, there's part 3 of that from Dr. Ketchum is out there now, supposedly.
Yep.
I don't know. I have no idea what would be covered there. But anyway, I hope what I've had to say makes some kind of sense, and I'd be glad to answer questions and talk about it further here again or any of the other many podcasts out there. I'm rambling now, but I'll
no, it's okay. Yeah, like I said, if Melba wants to come on, I will gladly suspend any disbelief or anything like that. I got a lot of tough questions, but I'm willing to listen to her out, hear explanations, and if they make sense, they make sense. If they don't, well, we're going to be talking about it. So
I'm a firm believer in being skeptical and researching the science and going where the science leads us. Right. But I'm not a firm believer in making leaps to something that the science didn't lead us to. You know, that's have one thing and then something else. And when we start talking about angel DNA or Nephilim or whatever, Nephilim.
I think that's the main problem with the Ketchum study, and it's going to be exactly the same problem is repeating itself with the new study. I mean, that's very clear. So So yeah, I don't really, I don't know what to say about how to convince someone else to look into something, you know, if they don't already take it seriously.
Right. Okay, folks. Chris, do your thing.
Well, again, I'd like to thank Mr. Kevin Harter for being on tonight. I appreciate you. It has been educational to the max, and I really enjoyed your paper. You know, I loved it. I'll tell you what, a lot of it is over here, but I understand you tried to dumb it down a little bit for people like me, and I appreciate that. but
I'm doing my best, but it's easy to.
It's still way up here. I want to thank everybody in the chat for listening with us and being with us tonight. We appreciate you guys. Sorry about the trouble in the beginning, but you know, if we can get on, we'll get on. Steve's pretty good about that stuff. First time listening on YouTube, give us a thumbs up. If you don't like the show, give us a thumbs down. Like, subscribe, share. We appreciate you.
Sharing is caring.
Yeah.
And before I begin to speak, we always got to do this.
Now comes the part where we throw our heads back and laugh. Ready?
Ready!
And there we are. Folks, I want to wish everybody a happy, healthy, safe week. We'll be back here next Sunday night, 9 p.m. Eastern, for another all-new Squatch-D TV. Out there, everybody out there, be safe, be healthy, God bless, and of course, keep on squatching. We'll catch you all next week.
Hey folks, you've been watching Squatch-D TV. Join us each week, Sunday night at 9 p.m. Eastern, for the latest on the Bigfoot mystery. As always, we thank you for being our loyal viewers and encourage all to subscribe to our YouTube page at youtube.com/Steve Kulls. As always, have a great week. Stay safe. God bless. And keep on squatching.